The revolution's begun. The time to stand up has come. We are the rocking of the throne. We are the rocking of the throne.
Victor Tiffany with Revolt against Plutocracy, with an interview and discussion today with Green Party presidential candidate Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein's campaign manager, David Cobb. David, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Victor, and a big shout out to Revolt against Plutocracy for what you're doing.
Appreciate that. I attended the Democracy Convention in Minnesota and appreciate your invitation to come out there. I caught a couple things you said during the workshop on increasing fascism, world fascism, and one of those two things, well, very quickly, the two things were that neoliberalism is trending toward fascism, and the other had to do with globalization. So let's first deal with neoliberalism before we talk about how it's trending toward fascism, which interests me because I cover it in Bernie or Bust, the book that has been submitted to a publisher. What is neoliberalism for you?
So, thank you for that. The main points of neoliberalism, really there are five. I'm going to list them quickly and then describe them in a little more detail. 1, the rule of the market, or market über alles. Number 2, cutting public expenditures for social services. 3, deregulation. 4, the concept of privatization. And 5, eliminating the concept of the public good. Victor, you can see how these are all interconnected, which is to say neoliberalism is an ideology. The concept of the rule of the market is the mistaken belief that if you liberate so-called free enterprise from governmental regulations, that you'll have greater openness, you'll have more international trade, and that it will actually be beneficial to everyone. It is much like Ronald Reagan's trickle-down or supply-side economics. The second concept of neoliberalism is cutting public expenditure for social services. And this means literally like education, healthcare, the water supply, etc. It is all done in the name of reducing the government's role. But remember, these are vital public services. So if you eliminate or reduce the governmental role in providing for governmental services or public services, you are literally going into the next concept, which is the privatization or corporatization of selling state-owned enterprises, such as banks, railroads, toll highways, electricity, hospitals, even fresh water supplies. So we're seeing this happen all over the country, and the neoliberals are trying to insist that this is a good thing, which is leading us to the fourth concept, which is deregulation, which is the idea of reducing governmental protections against everything. Because I want to switch from regulations to understanding that these are literally protections. They are protecting workers, public health, public safety, clean air, clean water. These are governmental protections that have gone through a democratic process. And then the 5 concept is literally an effort to eliminate the concept of the public good and replacing it with the idea of individual responsibility, and to pressure the poorest people in a society to find solutions for their lack of health care or education or social security, and then blaming them for being lazy. This overall ideology is the reason that you're seeing the conditions of neoliberalism creating austerity, and it is why the international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization are literally bringing us to this kind of neo-fascism that we're seeing, and you're seeing a huge struggle throughout the entire world. It's either going to be basically economic democracy, socialism, or it's going to be the barbarism of the corporatization of everything, also known as fascism.
So it was interesting to me when I heard you describe that, because, and I pointed this out in the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks or conference calls on Sunday night, if you look at the 14 characteristics of fascism, and I know you're familiar with them, and I'll put a link to them in the description below, the ninth characteristic is that fascists protect corporate power. But when you look at what's coming down the fast track with these trade agreements, the TPP has been set aside for now, thank goodness. It's not just that these corporatists or the powers that be are trying to protect corporate power. They're actually imposing. I mean, it's a whole new level of corporatization and an imposition of corporate power. Corporate power grab, what I call a corporate coup d'etat, literally taking the ability of our representatives in government to regulate foreign-based corporations away from them and allowing corporations to self-regulate rules and regulations that they came up with in secret negotiations. So
that's
I'm just wondering
right,
if there's...
And I really, that's right. You said a lot, so I want to break it down. It's important to remember that neoliberalism in this country is literally a merger of both Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. And we really need to understand that the leadership of both the Democratic and Republican Party are merging into what we'll call an extreme neoliberal agreement. And I also think
what we call political duopoly.
Political duopoly. That's fair. I'll absolutely use that word. But it is the leadership of both the Democratic and Republican parties merging together on economic issues. The second thing I really want to underscore is to remember that Benito Mussolini, the famous Italian fascist dictator and philosopher, remember, he was a thinker. Fascism is not just thugs in jackboots. It is an ideology. Benito Mussolini famously said, fascism more properly should be called corporatism because it merges the economic might of our corporations with the military might of our nation state into one. And he thought that was a good thing. And that's what we're seeing today. And remember, like, we have to recognize that it didn't just emerge out of Donald Trump or Steve Bannon or Breitbart. The reality is that ever since the Democratic Leadership Council basically took over the Democratic Party and began to impose this neoliberal agenda by going to Wall Street America, the big banks, and I mean the big mega banks and the large corporations, it is literally attacking the rights of labor, cutting back on social programs, and ultimately denying protection to children, youth, the planet itself. This is literally what the neoliberal agenda does, and we have to come to terms with the fact that both the leadership of the Democratic Party and the leadership of the Republican Party have merged together into this duopoly.
I frequently tweet that Trump is a symptom, neoliberalism is the disease.
Well, that's a good tweet. I'm going to start using it.
So the other topic has to do with globalization, which I had been involved with for many years before I got involved with overturning Citizens United and trying to create support for an amendment to the Constitution to do that. But the globalization that we were working on was a greater democracy, democratizing the United Nations, strengthening NGOs to assist with development, democratic socialist development, if you will, worker empowerment, and so forth. Globalization, since really probably Seattle, if not before, in what was that, 2000 or 1999, with those demonstrations on the trade talks that were taking place there, globalization has become a four-letter word. So I'm trying to, and in Bernie or Bust, the book I've submitted to the publisher, I've referenced corporate globalization without ever drawing out the contrast of what might be good kinds of globalization. Because right now we're confronted with the neoliberal corporate globalization versus the Bannon-Trump economic nationalism. So what, in your mind, are the alternatives to those two kinds of ideologies?
You know, I'm so glad that you actually use the adjective corporate globalization Victor, because that you're exactly right. What we were seeing is with the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the imposition of this neo-fascist agenda, a neoliberalism that is, again, morphing into neo-fascism because it's just a question of degree. And I'm against that. You're against that. Frankly, the overwhelming majority of people are against that. The problem is that if all you have is either globalization or economic nationalism, you cut off the ability to actually have the globalization of art and culture and food and ideas and the things that we actually want. I want to be very clear. I really appreciate that. I never wanted to be part of an anti-globalization movement because there are plenty of things that I want to globalize. I want to globalize peace, justice, democracy, and ecology. I want to globalize love and compassion. I want to globalize a jump and joyous world and self-actualization for human beings, liberty. I want to globalize those things. Here's the point. Corporate globalization describes the neoliberalism that morphs into neo-fascism. The other type of globalization would be a globalization of justice. So one of the languages that I tried to use, because I, like you, was very active in those struggles, I said that we were actually a global justice movement. And that's what we were trying to globalize. Because if we're just anti-globalization, it doesn't say what type of globalization we're opposing, nor does it actually say what we're for. So I am for a global justice movement. I am against a corporate globalization or a neoliberal or a neo-fascist globalization.
So in the few minutes we have left, explain how we might advance just globalization.
So one thing that we have to recognize, Victor, is that in the United States, we are actually late to the game. We're late to the intellectual framework. We're late to the actual organizing. For example, I remember thinking back in November of 1999, when I went to Seattle for the WTO demonstrations and then did a bunch of teach-ins immediately after it, is, wow, a global justice movement was just birthed. This is fantastic. That was hubris on my part. I was actually incorrect. What I have since learned is the global South was far ahead of us in the United States about actually understanding this. So what we have to do in the United States is to approach this conversation with a hell of a lot more humility and recognizing that we have a lot to learn from the global South. People who have been fighting against the corporatization, colonialization process for 500 years, some a little less, but this whole notion of corporate globalization is really a continuation of colonialization, right, or colonialism. And if we actually can learn to read Fanon, if we learn from Amilcar Cabral, if we learn from what is happening in the Latin American left, we can actually say, oh my gosh, what they learned how to do was build civil society or social movements and engage in electoral politics in an authentic way. They did not get stuck in a two-party system. They were willing to both build social movements to say what they were for and build new social, political, and economic institutions that actually met their needs, and they engaged the state. They thought about elections as yet another front of struggle. They didn't exclusively do elections, but they were also willing to engage in elections. So that, I think, is the key. We have to engage in organizing in our local communities and in our whatever nation state that we're in, but ultimately we need to start building networks across those. So I would encourage your viewers and your readers and others to learn from the MST movement in Brazil, to learn from the experience of the Egyptian uprising, to learn the anti-colonial pro-liberation struggles of Africa, and learn what worked and what didn't work. At the end of the day, Victor, I am committed to what Fanon called, the new humanism, the recognition that we will celebrate the cultural differences and I mean celebrate in a good way, and we will decolonialize ourselves. That we will actually emerge into a recognition of the good that each of us brings, but the things that are actually bad based on exploitation and oppression, we are going to eliminate those from our social, political, and economic institutions, or at least we will not incentivize them.
Well, I appreciate that, David. If I can encourage listeners and viewers to do something, it would be to share this video, and let's start getting some of these ideas out there.
Thank you so much, and I'm going to encourage that same thing. Remember this, folks. The work that Revolt Against Plutocracy is doing is only possible because you're only hearing this conversation because Victor and I have decided that we're not just going to hate the corporate media. We're going to try to create our own media. So please do not just share this, but comment on it. Don't just like it. Comment on it. That we've learned that's how the algorithm works. The second thing is to get involved. It actually helps if you join the mailing list for Revolt Against Plutocracy. Frankly, it helps if you join your local Green Party, if you get involved in your local state party, if you get involved in Democratic Socialist of America. The reality is that we have to educate ourselves and each other, and we have to collectivize and organize ourselves in a collective manner, because that's the only way that we can unite and fight to win a completely new world.
Right on. Thanks for that, David. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Victor.
Revolt Against Plutocracy won't just be covering the news about the necessary revolution in the United States. Sometimes we'll be making the news. If you want to stay on top of the revolutionary actions and strategies of grassroots, genuine progressives, and our allies, please subscribe to our YouTube channel today.